Armatures and Eyeforms. So this is part one of my video series on making this little silicone creature. And it's important to have a good plan in place before you get started. And that's really what I wanted to discuss with the armature and the Eyeforms in this video. But ultimately, our point in this is we're going to be making a resin mold that we will use to cast a little silicone and foam creature head. And we're going to use those Eyeforms out of TC808 resin to make those allowances for those eyes. And we're going to pop that out and paint it with more silicone. And of course, finish it by punching some hair into it so it looks like a realistic little silicone creature. But before all that, obviously, we need to get started sculpting our creature. And that, of course, requires an armature. Now I'm going to make the armature out of styrofoam, and overall this is pretty straightforward, but for those of you getting started doing this sort of thing, what I mainly wanted to cover here is some of the do's and don'ts about an armature, because obviously you could make this out of solid clay, but that tends to be a little bit unstable. I'll be using monster clay, which is a little bit firmer. I'm using medium monster clay for my sculpt, and that's a little bit firmer than some of the other softer clays out there, but still, it's not a good idea to make a solid clay sculpture. Now, the other thing I need to do is make my eye form. So I molded my acrylic eyes I'm going to be using for the final sculpture using TC5110F silicone. And here I'm pouring these eye forms in TC808 casting resin. And those are two materials. That's a good general purpose, low shrinkage, fast setting resin, and a fast setting silicone that's great for this kind of shop work like this. So anytime you have to reproduce eye forms or any other little parts, it's a great fast setting general purpose silicone to have around. And I'll link to all of the products I'm using in the video description, so be sure to check those out later on. Now, before we get too far into building up clay on our armature, obviously your armature could be made of plaster, it could be made of styrofoam like I'm using here. I just got some random little chunks of styrofoam from around my shop, but this styrofoam is fairly firm, and especially if you're using a rigid casting foam or plaster form to make your armature. Let's say this is our armature right here, and we're going to be building up our clay over that. So one of the important considerations is obviously it needs to be stable enough to support our clay. And of course, our little eye forms that we're going to stick on later. But you want to avoid flexible materials like newspaper or soft foam and use something that's relatively firm. And you want to make sure that you plan this out so you don't create undercuts between your rigid mold, because remember, later on, this is going to be a resin mold over the top of this sculpture. So we want to make sure that when we make that resin mold and the front and the back of that resin mold, once those pull apart in two halves or however many pieces we need to make this mold in, that we don't have any undercuts in the armature that are going to lock onto our resin mold that would make that difficult or impossible to remove. Now here we're using styrofoam and we could pry that out, but that is still an important consideration because you don't want your armature to wind up trapping everything together and making that mold harder to open later on. So for instance, on this piece, the areas we got to be careful about are the jaw and the nose and the base of the neck. We want to make sure we don't have undercut areas there where the resin mold on the outside pulls off the clay okay, but then gets trapped on the armature. And if we're using a plaster armature, that could ruin our mold or break the mold when we're trying to pull it apart. So this is a good example of a bad armature like that. So if we've got a plaster armature or rigid armature underneath, and you see how we've got that kind of jaw or beak or snout going down there, and what that does is that's creating a very deep undercut under the jaw or the beak or whatever. So if we have a very rigid armature, when we go to pull off the front half of the mold, that red area there is going to create a very difficult lock that could break the mold or break the armature or both. So you want to be very careful to avoid places like that and make sure you compensate for that as you're building up your armature and you don't create those lock areas that could lock onto that resin mold later on. So that's one of those minor things that can come back and get you later on in the process. So especially if you're using a plaster or rigid foam armature underneath, you don't want that creating a lock. So make sure before you start, you have a good plan of how you're going to make your mold, and everything can come off cleanly, and you have clay filling those undercut areas and not rigid armature material. So now we're ready to melt down our monster clay and brush that onto our foam armature. And what I typically do is I have my clay in a crock pot, and I usually put that on warm. And so it's kind of a mud consistency. And that's ideal for building up a sculpt like this, because that mud consistency is really nice to just spackle on and slowly start building up that form. And again, just keep that in the back of your mind. You want to be careful not to create deep undercuts between the armature and the final mold. Now, ultimately, we will be making a rigid mold, but we're actually going to make an intermediate mold in the next video, where I'm going to make a silicone mold of the sculpture before I make my resin mold. And the reason for that is the resin mold will destroy our sculpture. So by molding it first with silicone, that gives us added safety there. In case, heaven forbid, something goes sideways, we have to go back and make another clay positive. And now I'm ready to put my Eyeforms in place. Now this is another one of those little details when you're using Eyeforms like this, real important to make sure those Eyeforms are facing exactly the way you want them to be in the finished sculpture, because ultimately these Eyeforms will create little allowances for your acrylic eyes in the final silicone sculpture. So if they're kind of cattywampus facing opposite directions or anything like that, you're going to wind up with your eyes in your final sculpture looking the exact same way. So unless you want this kind of wall-eyed look or cross-eyed or whatever, make sure your eyes are facing the same direction. So here's a view looking down on our little creature head, and you see how I put those Eyeforms in so they're parallel to each other. And again, small little detail here, but ultimately very important, because you can't go back and redo this once you get to the silicone casting phase. So just remember, if for some reason one of your eyes is off or facing the wrong direction, unless that's what you want, that's exactly the way you're going to wind up with your eyes going into your finished piece. So remember, all this points towards that final end result where we have our silicone part, and the whole point of these Eyeforms is we have little allowances that make sure our eyes pop right into our sculpture and are already set facing the right direction. So just make sure your Eyeforms from the start are exactly the way you want them to be. And you'll notice there I put some little black dots on the pupils, so I have a general idea, just for the sake of sculpting, where my sculpture is looking and how those eyes are ultimately going to be oriented in that final sculpture. Now, for time's sake in this video, I'm just going to go over some of the basics on sculpting, because really, ultimately, you either can sculpt or you can't, because sculpting is one of those things that you just need to have a good understanding of anatomy and mass, and you just got to push a lot of clay around until you get used to making it do what you want it to do. And you'll notice my clay pot, it's gotten to the point where it's more of like a taffy kind of consistency. And that's one of the things I like about monster clay, is I unplug that crock pot after it goes through that brushable consistency, and then it just gradually thickens up to the point where it becomes more like traditional modeling clay. And that works out perfect. We can rough out the form and gradually start building up the shape and getting the details the way we want, and then start switching over to sculpting tools. Now, it is a good idea to use sulfur-free clay, because remember, anything in your workshop that you're going to be working around platinum silicone, it is a chance for contamination. If it contains any sulfur in it, that is a chance to contaminate other things in your shop. So always a good idea to make sure you're using clays that are sulfur-free. And also in this process, because I'm going to be making a platinum silicone mold of this sculpture later on, that's another reason for this to be sulfur-free. And a little side note about that, monster clay has a really good track record of not inhibiting platinum silicone. There are some other clays out there that occasionally, even though they are technically sulfur-free, sometimes, I don't know if it's the guy operating the clay machine or what, will sometimes be contaminated, and you could still wind up with surface inhibition. So be very careful when you're working with your clay, that even when it's sulfur-free, make sure you do a test to make sure everything is going to cure well. But more about that in the follow-up video. Now, overall, this is a pretty quick sculpt I did in an afternoon. Again, something, just a wild brainstorm I had for one of my kids. I am just a caveman thought out by your scientists, so my sculpting abilities are probably much less than yours, dear viewers. So I'm sure you will make much more awesome creations than I will. But here's some of the key things you want to be aware of. Is around the eyelids, you want to make sure you really square off those eyelids around those eye forms. If you get too thin around the eyes, it's going to be really difficult for your silicone to fill those areas. So make sure that you don't have eyelids that are just tapered right into the eye form. Make sure you use a dental spatula or similar tool to come in there and really give yourself some nice squared off eyelids, so that way everything can line up nicely later on. Because again, if you just feather those out into a really thin edge, for one, that's not really a realistic eyelid, but second of all, it's going to be very difficult to get those to cast properly in the final casting stage. So now that I've got my eyelids roughly the way I want them, now I'm ready to start detailing the clay and texturing the surface of the clay. And at that point, there's a variety of tools you can use. As you might have seen in the previous video where I made the little clay belly button, I really like my wire brushes and my nylon brushes for doing skin texture. But really, it's all up to you and how much time you want to spend on your sculpture. This little guy, I think I spent maybe a couple of hours on him. So this is not by any means an amazing sculpture, but I mainly wanted you to see the use of those eye forms in this kind of context. And now I'm just using a little stylus tool and a little piece of drop cloth material to do some pores on the little nose there. And believe it or not, this little sculpture is going to be a little princess, a beautiful princess when she's all done. So believe it or not, this is a cute little girl, but more about that in a later video. But here I'm just going in and adding some pore texture. And again, this is where wire brushes, nylon brushes are really helpful for doing some of those little wrinkles and things like that. And this is one of the magical things about sculpting. You can take as much time as you want to get your sculpture exactly the way you like it. Now for me, because I'm in a hurry and I wanted to get this done, I went ahead and powdered this little girl with some baby powder. And this helps me remove some of those little crumbly pieces of sculpture and helps you get a good idea of your final sculpt, whether or not you need to do any more texturing. And now ready to just brush off that baby powder, check our sculpt, and of course we can still add more texture, but this will give you a good idea, remove any of those little crumbly things and give you a good idea of what your surface looks like. And now ready for our final little bit of detailing before we start prepping this for the first mold. So I went ahead and added a few more little pores here and there with my stylus tool and detailed a few other little places. Again, this is not going to win any awards, but I think the final result was pretty cute, if I do say so myself. Also, this is another good argument for making a good, stable armature. If everything is glued and adhered together right, you can flip this thing upside down and work on the chin, any angle you need to get the work done to get your sculpture just right, without worrying about the head falling off or something like that. So again, good argument for having a good, stable armature. Now this was small enough that I could do this whole thing just hot gluing those pieces of styrofoam together. But if it was any bigger than that, especially if this was a regular human-size head bust, I would actually run a piece of pipe up through the styrofoam and glue everything to that to hold it all together. So here is our finished clay sculpture. I've stuck in a couple of acrylic teeth there. And I'm going to put those in. Those are going to be in the final silicone. So I'm mainly using those acrylic teeth, kind of like the Eyeforms, just as a placeholder for ultimately, so the finished clay sculpture will have little divots where those teeth go later on. So now we're ready to seal our sculpture with some ClearGuard. This is ClearGuard Satin from Sculpt Nouveau. This is a good clear sealer that won't inhibit platinum silicone. And you can even, this is flexible enough that you can even detail a little bit over the top. So I've even gone back and added more pore texture once I've applied my sealer. So I usually do a couple to 3 coats of clear sealer over my sculpture. And it's important to remember when you're doing multiple coats of a sealer or paint like this, especially when you're going to be making a silicone mold, make sure you give it time to dry in between layers. So once I spray on a coat, I let that dry for about an hour, hour and a half or so, come back and spray on another layer and then another final layer. But I usually do about 2 to 3 coats of clear sealer over my sculpture before I proceed. And then I let all that dry for several hours, if not overnight. Now stay tuned, we're going to do some follow-up with additional videos covering the mold making process with silicone as well as a resin mold, and then on to the silicone casting process. Now as always, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and of course stay tuned for the next videos, and thanks for watching.